I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, a soldier who emerged from the battlefield carrying not only the dust of the desert, but also questions that have never found clear answers. I did not come to politics from corridors of power, but from the harsh reality of a nation struggling to redefine itself amid pressure, amid choices, and amid forces that do not always reveal themselves. I have learned to listen, not only to what is said, but also to the silences between the words, because sometimes the truth does not lie in what is spoken, but in what people deliberately leave unsaid. In this world, where every handshake can carry multiple layers of meaning, and every smile can conceal a calculation, silence becomes the most unsettling thing of all. And that silence reveals itself clearly in this story. At the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, from February 12 to 14, 2026, everything unfolded as one would expect. Polished speeches, ceremonial handshakes, and promises of security, development, and regional cooperation. On the surface, everything was perfect. But it was precisely that perfection that made me uneasy. Because what is concerning does not lie in what is said, but in what is withheld. Conversations would abruptly stop as we approached. Glances would pass, then quickly turn away. A quiet but unmistakable attention was directed toward the Sahel countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad. No one said anything, but everyone was watching. I understood one thing very clearly. When everything appears too smooth, it means the most important decisions are being made somewhere else. This summit was not just diplomacy. Something larger and more dangerous was beginning to take shape beneath the surface of polite words. The real conversation had not yet begun. And when it does, it will not only test politics, it will force each person to confront their own conscience. But the question is, who started it? And what do they really want? The first signal came quietly, almost politely, as many dangerous things often do. It was around 8:45 in the evening on the 12th of February. The official sessions of the day had ended. The cameras were gone. The formal speeches had concluded. Delegations were returning to their rooms, preparing for the next day of what appeared to be routine discussions. I was with my team reviewing notes when the message arrived. It did not come through the usual channels. There was no official notice circulated among delegations. No mention in the public schedule. No prior indication that such a meeting even existed. It was delivered discreetly, directly, and only to a very small group. Not to all African leaders. Not to a regional bloc. Only to four of us. Myself, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, Assimi Goïta of Mali, Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger, Mahamat Idriss Déby of Chad. That alone was enough to make me pause. The invitation described the meeting in very soft terms. It was presented as a private exchange, a sincere discussion, an opportunity to talk openly about the future of the Sahel, about security cooperation, about development partnerships. There was no pressure in the wording, no urgency, no visible agenda that could raise concern at first glance. But what made it unusual was not what it said, it was how it was arranged. It bypassed our official secretariats, it did not include our full advisory teams, it was not open to the press, there was no public record attached to it. And most importantly, it was scheduled late in the evening, after all formal activities had ended. That is not how transparent diplomacy works. If a discussion is meant to be open, it happens during the day. If it is meant to be official, it is documented. If it is meant to be fair, it includes the proper structures. This meeting had none of those elements. And that is when I began to understand. This was not an extension of the summit. This was something separate. The names attached to the invitation confirmed that feeling. The representatives were from the G7 and from NATO. Among them were figures like Antony Blinken, representing strategic and diplomatic interests, and Jens Stoltenberg, representing military alignment and security frameworks. These were not minor officials. These were people who do not attend meetings without purpose, and certainly not meetings that are not recorded. I read the invitation again, slowly. A private meeting, a sincere exchange, a discussion about cooperation. The words were calm, but the structure was not. Because if they truly wanted cooperation, they could have brought these topics into the official sessions. If they truly wanted transparency, they would not need to isolate four leaders from the rest. If they truly wanted partnership, they would not begin in secrecy. And then I saw the pattern. They did not invite Africa. They invited the Sahel. They did not gather everyone. They selected only those who stand on land that holds strategic value beyond what is spoken publicly. Gold, uranium, critical minerals, and territory that sits at a crossroads of influence. I leaned back for a moment, not reacting immediately, because sometimes the most important decisions are not made in what you say first, but in what you choose to understand before speaking. I knew then that this was not a social meeting. It was not a gesture of goodwill. It was a targeted approach, carefully designed, carefully limited, carefully timed. They were not trying to listen. They were trying to position. And the fact that it happened at night, outside all formal structures, told me one thing very clearly. Whatever was about to be discussed, it was not meant to belong to official history. It was meant to exist in silence. And silence in international politics is rarely neutral. It is often where the real decisions are made. I looked at the other leaders, and I could sense that they too understood something was not ordinary. No one said it directly, but we all knew. This invitation was not about conversation. It was about something else, something that required privacy, something that required discretion, something that perhaps could not withstand the light of day. And in that moment, I accepted the meeting, not because I trusted it, but because I needed to see it, to understand it, to face it directly. Because sometimes you do not avoid the room where decisions are made. You walk into it fully aware, fully present, and fully prepared. But as I stood up to leave for that meeting, one thought remained very clear in my mind. They had not invited us by accident. They had chosen us. And when someone chooses you so precisely, it is never without reason. I just did not yet know how far that reason would go, and I did not yet know what would be placed before us that night. But I knew this. This was the moment when the summit ended, and something far more serious began. Core message of this section: not all invitations are gestures of respect. Some are carefully designed openings into negotiations that are never meant to be seen. And the moment something is hidden, you must ask yourself why. The meeting was held on the 5th floor of the African Union complex. Not in one of the large conference halls where decisions are announced, but in a smaller, controlled space. A room designed for conversations that are not meant to leave the walls that contain them. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the calm silence of diplomacy, but a deliberate one. The kind created when access is restricted, when movement is controlled, when every detail has been arranged in advance. The doors were closed behind us. Security was present but discreet. No press, no recording equipment visible, no official documentation being prepared in the open. It was clear that whatever would happen inside that room was not intended to be part of any formal report. Everything about it felt outside the system. Inside, there were many more people than I expected. 74 representatives connected to various political, financial, and strategic structures aligned with the G7. 2 senior representatives from NATO. It was not a casual meeting. It was a carefully assembled group, each person there for a reason. And then there were us, 4 leaders from the Sahel, entering a room where the balance was already defined before we even sat down. We took our seats. The atmosphere, at first, was warm. They greeted us with courtesy. They spoke of shared history, of cooperation, of the challenges we all face in maintaining stability in the region. They used familiar language, well-practiced and carefully delivered. They spoke about partnership. They spoke about responsibility. They spoke about the fight against terrorism, about development, about the need to work together for a safer and more prosperous future. If someone had entered the room at that moment without context, they would have thought it was a positive exchange, a constructive dialogue between partners with aligned interests. But I have listened to this language before, and over time I have learned that the more perfect the words sound, the more carefully you must examine what lies behind them. Because in international politics, the most comforting words are often used to introduce the most difficult conditions. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to understand the direction. And slowly, it became clear. This meeting was not designed to hear us. It was designed to guide us. Every statement they made was leading somewhere. Every sentence was building towards something that had already been decided before we entered the room. They were not exploring possibilities. They were preparing to present terms. That realization changed everything, because once you understand that you are not part of a discussion, but part of a process designed to reach a predetermined outcome, you begin to listen differently. You stop hearing the surface. You begin to hear intention. The word stability began to sound like control. The word cooperation began to sound like alignment. The phrase shared responsibility began to sound like obligation. And I understood something very clearly at that moment. This was not a meeting between equal partners. It was a negotiation where one side had already written the structure. We were simply expected to respond. I sat there listening carefully, watching not just what they said, but how they said it. The tone was calm. The delivery was smooth. The confidence was absolute, because they believed they were in control of the room. And perhaps in terms of numbers and preparation they were, but there is something they could not measure. They could not measure what each of us carried within. They could not measure what would guide our decisions when the moment came. And as I sat there, I felt a quiet certainty forming. This meeting was not about dialogue. It was about negotiation, and not the kind that seeks balance, but the kind that seeks agreement on their terms. I placed my hands calmly on the table and continued to listen, because I knew that soon the real purpose of this meeting would reveal itself. And when it did, there would be no more soft introductions, no more familiar phrases, no more careful distance. There would only be the moment where everything becomes clear, and that moment was coming. It did not take long before the tone of the room shifted. The opening language of cooperation slowly gave way to something more structured, more direct. The kind of speech that no longer tries to create comfort but begins to define expectations. One of the representatives leaned forward slightly, and I could feel the transition before he even spoke. This was the moment when polite words would turn into clear conditions. They did not present it as demands. They presented it as opportunities. But in politics, the way something is presented does not change what it is. And what they offered us that night came in three parts. The first condition concerned military presence. They spoke about the need for long-term stability in the Sahel. They emphasized the threat of terrorism, the challenges of securing vast territories, and the importance of intelligence sharing. All of this was familiar, but then they moved further. They proposed a structured long-term presence of NATO forces in the region, particularly in the Liptako-Gourma area, where Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger meet. They described it as support, as assistance, as a partnership that would strengthen our capacity, training programs, logistical support, shared intelligence systems. It was presented as a solution, but I understood what it meant. When a foreign military force establishes a long-term presence on your land, it does not remain simply as a guest. It becomes a factor, a permanent one. It begins to shape decisions. It influences operations. It creates dependencies. And over time, even if no one says it openly, control begins to shift. Not completely, not immediately, but steadily. The justification is always security, but the result is rarely limited to that. I listened carefully, without reacting, because the first condition was not isolated. It was connected to something larger. The second condition moved into economic territory. They began to speak about investment, about unlocking the potential of the region's resources: gold, uranium, lithium, manganese, rare earth elements. They spoke of technology, expertise, infrastructure, and global market access. They mentioned companies such as Barrick Gold and Anglo Gold Ashanti, along with financial institutions and investment groups ready to participate. And then they presented the structure. 70% of the net profit would go to the foreign consortium. 30% would remain with the host nations. Again, it was presented as a partnership, as a shared benefit, as an opportunity for growth. But I've learned to look beyond percentages, because numbers on paper do not tell the full story. Who controls the extraction process? Who controls the data about the resources? Who controls the transportation? Who controls the export channels? Who sets the pricing? Who audits the operations? If all of those elements are in the hands of one side, then the percentage becomes symbolic. You may be told you have 30%, but in reality, you only receive what you are allowed to see. And more importantly, you lose something that cannot be measured in numbers. Control. Control over your own wealth. Control over your future. And once that control is transferred, it is rarely returned easily. These contracts are not short-term. They bind generations. They shape economies for decades. And they are often signed in rooms like this one, quietly, without witnesses, without immediate consequences, but with long-term effects that cannot be undone. I felt the weight of that understanding settle in my mind. And then came the third condition. This one was less direct, less detailed, but far more significant. They spoke about alignment, about strategic cooperation, about the importance of shared political direction in a changing global environment. They mentioned long-term security agreements lasting 15 to 20 years. They spoke about economic frameworks connected to institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. They suggested the need to prioritize partnerships within their sphere while gradually reducing or limiting cooperation with actors outside their structure. And then, quietly, they referred to positions in international forums. Votes, statements, decisions, all expected to follow a certain direction. They did not say it as an order. They said it as an understanding, but I understood perfectly. The first condition was about physical presence. The second was about economic control. The third was about political alignment. Together, they formed a complete structure. Control the land, control the resources, control the decisions. And once those three are connected, sovereignty becomes something that exists in name, but not in reality. I sat there, looking at them, and I realized something very important. This was not a proposal. It was a framework, a system designed to integrate our countries into a structure where independence would gradually become limited, not through force, not through invasion, but through agreement, through signatures, through cooperation that slowly reshapes authority. And the most dangerous part of it was this. It did not look like domination. It looked like opportunity. That is how modern control works. It does not arrive with tanks. It arrives with contracts. It arrives with partnerships. It arrives with words that sound beneficial. And that is why it is harder to resist. Because to resist it, you must first see it clearly. And in that room, I saw it clearly. I understood that what they were offering was not simply assistance. It was a path that would lead our nations into a position where decisions would no longer be entirely ours. And once I understood that, everything else became simple. The question was no longer what they were offering. The question was whether we would accept it. And I knew that whatever came next would not be easier. Because after presenting conditions like these, there is always another step. And that step is designed to make refusal more difficult. I remained silent, watching, listening, waiting, because I knew the next phase was coming. And it would not be about strategy. It would be about something else entirely. Something more direct, something more personal, and something far more dangerous. After the three conditions were laid out, something changed in the room. Not in structure, but in tone. The conversation moved away from strategy, from regional stability, from long-term agreements. It became quieter, slower, more focused, more personnel. One of the representatives, speaking with a calm and almost reassuring voice, leaned slightly forward. His expression softened. The language he used was no longer directed at nations. It was directed at individuals, at us. He spoke as if what was coming next was not part of the negotiation, but a form of understanding. As if he was offering clarity, even kindness. But I understood what it was. This was the moment where principles are tested not by arguments but by temptation. He began by saying something that on the surface sounded reasonable. He said that leadership is difficult, that we carry heavy responsibilities, that we face pressures that most people will never understand. And then he said that those who carry such responsibilities deserve security, not just for their nations, but for themselves, for their families, for their future. It was presented as recognition, but it was not recognition. It was preparation. Then the first offer came. They spoke of international banking access. Each of us, they said, would have a private account established in Switzerland, a respected institution, discreet, secure, beyond the reach of instability. They mentioned a specific figure, $50 million, for each of us, not as a loan, not as an investment, but as something that would simply exist, available, protected, untouched by political changes. He did not rush when he said it. He allowed the number to sit in the air, because numbers like that do not need explanation. They carry their own weight, but I did not see it as a gift. I saw it as something else, a price, not a reward, not appreciation, a price placed quietly on a human decision. And more than that, a price placed on silence, because money like that is never given without expectation. Even when no contract is written, even when no words are spoken, the expectation exists, and it binds more strongly than any official agreement. Then they continued. They moved from the immediate to the ongoing. They spoke about participation in the resource partnerships, not in an official capacity, but in a personal one. They explained that beyond the national agreements, there would be private structures, trusts, intermediary companies, anonymous shares, Through these channels, each of us would receive a percentage, between 3 and 5%. Not publicly, not visibly, but consistently, year after year, based on extraction, based on production, based on the very resources that belong to our nations. They even estimated the returns, $10 to $20 million per year. For each of us, not once, but continuously. I listened carefully, because what they were describing was not simple corruption. It was something more refined. A system designed to tie personal wealth directly to national exploitation, so that over time, the line between serving the country and benefiting from its resources becomes blurred, until it disappears completely. And when that happens, decisions are no longer made for the people. They are made for the structure that feeds the individual. Then they moved further. They spoke about security, about mobility, about life beyond office. They offered special visa privileges, freedom to travel across Europe and North America without restriction, residency options, protection for us, for our families. They spoke about homes, private residences in places like Geneva, Brussels, or Paris, properties valued between $12 and $15 million, not as loans, not as investments, but as guarantees. A future that would remain untouched, regardless of what happens politically. And as they spoke, I understood the message beneath the words. You do not need to worry. You do not need to struggle. You do not need to carry the weight of uncertainty. Just agree, and everything will be taken care of. It was not aggressive. It was not forced. It was presented as ease, as relief, as a solution to every invisible fear a leader might carry. But the most powerful moment came last. Without announcement, without explanation, 4 cases were brought into the room, placed directly in front of us, one for each of us. No one needed to open them to understand what they contained, but they opened them anyway. Inside each case was cash, $5 million, in physical form, not numbers on a screen, not a promise, not something distant, something immediate, something tangible, something real. And in that moment, everything became clear. This was not about future agreements anymore. This was about now. This was about breaking the final barrier. Because there is a difference between hearing about money and seeing it in front of you. There is a difference between imagining wealth and having it placed within reach. They were no longer speaking to our positions. They were speaking to something deeper, something more human. They were testing whether conviction could withstand reality. I remember looking at the case in front of me, not with desire, but with awareness, because I understood what it represented. It was not just money. It was a question, a silent one. Who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when everything can change with a single decision? Who are you when the price is no longer abstract but visible, heavy, undeniable? The room became very still. No one spoke. And that silence carried more weight than anything that had been said before. Because in that silence, each of us was no longer a leader. We were individuals, standing at a line that cannot be seen, but once crossed, can never be undone. And I knew at that moment that what mattered next would not be strategy. It would not be negotiation. It would not be diplomacy. It would be something else, something far more difficult. A decision that would define not only what we do, but who we are. There are moments in life when time does not move the way it usually does. That night, inside that closed room, time slowed down. Not because anything stopped, but because everything became heavier. Every second seemed to stretch, as if the air itself was waiting for a decision to be made. No one spoke. The representatives across the table said nothing further. They did not need to. They had already said enough. Now they were watching, waiting, measuring. The room was no longer filled with words. It was filled with pressure. And that pressure was not external. It came from within. I looked at the case in front of me again, not directly, but enough to acknowledge its presence. It sat there in silence, but it carried a weight far greater than what it physically contained. Because it was not just money, it was possibility. The kind of possibility that can quietly begin to reshape a person's thinking. And I knew that I was not the only one feeling it. I did not look at the others in a way that would judge them, because I understood something very clearly. No human being stands in front of such an offer without being tested. It is easy to speak about integrity when nothing is at stake. It is easy to reject corruption when it is small, when it is obvious, when it is far away. But when the offer is large enough to change generations, when it is placed directly in front of you, when it asks for nothing more than a quiet agreement, then the test becomes real. And in that moment, the mind begins to speak. Not loudly, but convincingly. It begins to suggest small justifications. It begins to soften the boundaries. It begins to create reasons. You could tell yourself that accepting does not mean abandoning your country. You could tell yourself that you can take the offer and still serve your people. You could tell yourself that with more resources personally, you might even be in a stronger position to help. You could tell yourself that the world works this way, and refusing it changes nothing. These thoughts do not arrive as lies. They arrive as logic, carefully shaped, quietly persuasive. And that is how compromise begins. Not with betrayal, but with reasoning, with a single thought that says, perhaps this is acceptable. Perhaps this is not as wrong as it seems. Perhaps this is necessary. And once that thought is accepted, even for a moment, something shifts. A line that once felt solid begins to blur. And once it blurs, it becomes easier to cross. I sat there, aware of all of this, not outside of it, but inside it, because I am human. I could feel the weight of what was being offered. I could understand the scale of it. I could see what it represented in practical terms: security, comfort, freedom from uncertainty, not only for me, but for those around me. And I understood why this method works. They do not offer small amounts. They do not offer something you can easily dismiss. They offer something large enough to make you pause, large enough to make you think, large enough to make you question your own certainty. Because once you begin to question yourself, the decision is no longer clear. And that is exactly where they want you. Not convinced, but uncertain. Because uncertainty is easier to guide. The silence in the room was not empty. It was filled with that uncertainty. Each of us was facing it in our own way. And I knew that whatever happened next would not be visible. There would be no dramatic gesture, no announcement, no clear signal. It would be internal, a decision made quietly, a decision that would never appear in any official document, but a decision that would shape everything that follows. I remember thinking in that moment that this was not a negotiation between nations anymore. This was something else entirely. This was a test of identity, not who we are in public, but who we are when everything is reduced to a single choice. And I realized something important. The danger was not in the money itself. The danger was in the ability of the mind to make it acceptable. Because once something feels acceptable, even if it is wrong, it no longer feels like a betrayal. It feels like a decision. And that is how people lose themselves. Not all at once, but gradually, step by step, thought by thought, until one day they no longer recognize the line they once refused to cross. I sat there, breathing slowly, allowing the moment to unfold without rushing it, because I knew that reacting too quickly would not bring clarity. I needed to see it fully, to understand it completely, to face it without avoiding it, because only then could the decision be real. And in that silence, I felt something begin to shift, not outside, but within me, something deeper than thought, something that was not trying to justify, something that was not trying to calculate, something that was not influenced by the numbers in front of me. And I understood that what was coming next would not come from strategy. It would come from somewhere else, somewhere I had not yet fully reached. But it was there, waiting. And I knew that when it spoke, the decision would no longer be uncertain. The silence did not last forever. It never does. There comes a point in every carefully constructed moment when patience begins to wear thin. When those who believe they are in control expect a response. And when that response does not come quickly enough, the tone begins to change. Shift in posture, a tightening in expression. The relaxed confidence that had filled the room began to fade, replaced by something more rigid. They had presented the offer. They had placed the incentive directly in front of us. And now they were waiting for agreement. But agreement did not come. And when it did not come, something else emerged. The language changed. The warmth disappeared. The conversation no longer revolved around opportunity, but around consequences. They did not raise their voices. They did not need to. The message was delivered calmly, but the meaning was unmistakable. One of them spoke about the importance of alignment in the international system, about how nations that choose cooperation tend to benefit from stronger relationships, broader support, and greater access to resources. And then, almost in the same breath, he spoke about isolation. Not as a threat, but as a possibility. A natural outcome, he suggested, for those who choose a different path. Another voice followed, speaking about financial systems, about how global access depends on trust, about how institutions make decisions based on stability and partnership, and how, without those elements, things can become more complicated. Funding can slow down. Support can become uncertain. Processes can become more difficult. He did not say sanctions. He did not say restrictions, but the meaning was clear. Then came the mention of perception, how narratives are shaped, how international media can influence how governments are seen, how quickly reputations can change when certain stories begin to circulate. Instability, authoritarian tendencies, human rights concerns. Words that once attached to a country can follow it for years. They spoke about it as if it were outside their control, as if it were simply the nature of the world. But I understood. Nothing in that room was accidental. Not the offer, not the structure, and certainly not this shift in tone. This was the final stage. First, they invite. Then, they offer. And when neither produces immediate agreement, they apply pressure. Not through force, but through implication, through suggestion, through carefully chosen words that do not command, but make the consequences feel inevitable. I sat there, listening to it all, and I felt something become very clear. This was never a negotiation between equals. This was a system, a process that has been used many times before. Approach quietly, offer generously, and if necessary, remind firmly. And in that moment, I understood the full shape of what we were facing. This was not about helping the Sahel. This was about controlling it, not through visible domination, but through influence that becomes so deep it no longer needs to show itself. Because once a leader accepts the first step, the rest follows naturally, not because they are forced, but because they are already tied to the system. And I realized something else. They were not just looking for agreement. They were looking for compliance. They wanted leaders who would align, who would follow, who would make decisions within a structure already defined. And in return, they offered protection, access, comfort, security, but at a cost that is never written but always understood. The cost of independence, the cost of speaking freely, the cost of deciding based only on the needs of one's own people. And I knew in that moment that if someone accepted this, they would not immediately feel the loss. It would not happen all at once. It would happen gradually, decision by decision, agreement by agreement, until one day they would realize that the space to choose freely no longer exists because it had already been given away. And the most difficult part is this. From the outside, it would still look like leadership. It would still look like authority. But inside, it would be something else. Something constrained. Something guided. Something no longer fully sovereign. I looked around the room again. The cases were still there. The offers had not been withdrawn. The pressure had simply been added. And I understood that this was the final test. Not just of what we would choose, but of what we truly believed. Because when pressure is applied, the truth becomes visible. Not the truth people speak, but the truth they act on. And I knew that my moment was approaching. The moment where silence would no longer be enough. The moment where I would have to respond. Not carefully, not strategically, but clearly, because sometimes clarity is the only answer that matters. And in that moment, I felt something settle inside me. A certainty that had been forming quietly since the beginning. It was no longer a question. It was no longer a conflict. It was something solid, something I could not ignore. And I understood that whatever I was about to say would not just be a response to them. It would be a statement of who I am and what I stand for. And once spoken, it could not be taken back. But I was ready, because some decisions are not made in the moment. They are made long before in the values a person chooses to carry. And that night, those values were about to speak. There comes a point when silence is no longer strength. There comes a point when not speaking becomes a form of agreement. And I knew that moment had arrived. I did not rush. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood up, not to create tension, but because I understood that what I was about to say could not be spoken from a position of hesitation. I looked at them, one by one, not with anger, but with clarity. Because anger clouds the message. Clarity reveals it. and I wanted them to understand exactly what I meant. I began slowly. I told them that I had listened carefully, that I understood the structure of what they were proposing, that I recognized the effort that had gone into preparing this meeting. And then I paused, not for effect, but to make sure that what came next would not be misunderstood. I told them that what they had presented was not cooperation, it was control. Not immediate, not visible, but real. I told them that our countries are not territories waiting to be organized by others. They are nations, with people who have suffered, struggled, and endured more than most systems can measure. And those people did not endure all of that so that their future could be negotiated in a closed room. I told them something else, something simple, but important, that we are not for sale, not our land, not our resources, not our decisions, and certainly not our conscience. I did not say it with emotion. I said it with certainty, because certainty does not need to be loud. It only needs to be true. I looked at the case in front of me briefly, then back at them, and I said that money does not define value, that a number, no matter how large, cannot measure what a people deserve, and it cannot buy what was never meant to be sold. I explained that what they were offering was not new. That history is filled with moments where power has tried to reshape weaker nations through agreements that appear beneficial at first. But time always reveals the truth, and the truth is simple. If you lose control over your land, your resources, and your decisions, then you lose something far greater than any financial gain. You lose your future. I told them that I understand the pressures of leadership, that I understand the weight of responsibility, but that responsibility is not to comfort. It is to duty, to the people, to those who cannot sit in rooms like this, to those who trust that the decisions made here will protect them, not trade them. And then I said something that changed the air in the room. I told them that I do not measure my decisions by what I can gain. I measure them by what I am willing to lose. And there are things I will not lose. I will not lose the right to stand before my people and speak honestly. I will not lose the ability to make decisions without hidden obligations. And I will not lose myself, because once that is gone, nothing else matters. I could see their expressions change, not dramatically, but enough to know that this was not the response they expected. They expected negotiation. They expected adjustment. They expected hesitation, but they did not expect refusal, that did not ask for anything in return. And that is what unsettled them, because negotiation can be managed. Refusal cannot. I continued calmly. I told them that if they truly wish to work with Africa, then it must be done in the open, with respect, with fairness, without conditions that remove sovereignty, without structures that benefit one side while weakening the other, and without offers that target individuals instead of nations. Because once you begin to deal with individuals instead of institutions, you are no longer building partnerships. You are building dependence, and dependence is not cooperation. It is control in another form. I finished by saying something very simple, that we are willing to cooperate, but we are not willing to submit. And there is a difference, a very important difference. Then I sat down, not to end the conversation, but because I had said what needed to be said. There was nothing more to add. Because truth, once spoken clearly, does not need repetition. The room felt different after that. Not louder, not more tense, just different. Because something had shifted. The direction they had prepared was no longer certain. The outcome they had expected was no longer guaranteed. And I understood that this was only the beginning of the response. Because refusal does not end pressure. It changes it. But I was not concerned about what would come next. Because the decision had already been made. And once a decision is made with clarity, the rest becomes easier to face. I knew that I had not just refused an offer. I had refused a system, a way of doing things that has existed for a long time. And I knew that systems do not accept refusal easily. But that did not matter, because there are moments when the cost of accepting is greater than the cost of refusing. And that night, I chose to refuse. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. And as I sat there, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief, not victory, but alignment. The kind that comes when your decision matches what you truly believe. And in that alignment, there is strength, a quiet strength. The kind that does not depend on circumstances. The kind that does not change under pressure. The kind that comes from knowing that you have not compromised what cannot be replaced. But even as I sat there, I knew something else. What I had said was not the most unexpected part. The most unexpected part had not yet been spoken. And it was not about politics. It was about something deeper, something they had not prepared for, something they could not influence. And that was what would come next. As I sat down after speaking, the room remained still. But inside me, something continued. Because the words I had just spoken did not begin in that moment. They came from somewhere deeper, somewhere older, somewhere that had been formed long before I ever entered a political office, long before I sat at any negotiation table, long before I carried the title of president. In that silence, I was no longer fully in that room. I was remembering, not in a distant way, but in a way that felt present, as if time had folded for a moment and brought me back to a different place. A place far removed from politics, a place of faith. I remembered the moment of my baptism, the quiet atmosphere of the church, the stillness that is different from any other silence, because it is filled with meaning, the presence of something greater than human authority, water placed gently, words spoken with purpose, and a question asked not to the body but to the soul, a question that seems simple when you hear it but carries a weight that only reveals itself over time. Do you renounce evil? Do you reject the forces that seek to lead you away from truth? Do you turn away from the temptations that promise much but take something greater in return? At that moment in my life, I answered, as many do, with sincerity, with conviction, but without fully understanding what those words would demand one day. Because when you stand in a place of faith, surrounded by peace, those words feel natural. They feel right. They feel aligned with everything you believe. But it is not in that moment that those words are tested. They are tested later, in places like that room, in moments where nothing feels sacred, where there is no church, no ceremony, no visible presence of anything beyond human intention, only pressure, only temptation, only choice. And as I sat there, I realized something very clearly. The offer placed before me was not just political. It was not just financial. It was something else. It was a temptation, not in a symbolic sense, but in a real, immediate, undeniable way. The money, the promises, the security, the comfort, all of it was presented as benefit. But beneath it, there was something deeper, an exchange, not just of decisions, but of integrity, of direction, of identity. And I understood that if I accepted it, I would not just be making a political compromise. I would be breaking something within myself, something I had once declared before God. And in that moment, everything became clear. I could no longer hear their voices as clearly as before, not because they had stopped speaking, but because something else had become louder, not externally, but within me, a memory, a vow, a truth I had once accepted without knowing how much it would matter. I remembered the words, not exactly as they were spoken that day, but in their meaning, to turn away from what corrupts, to reject what distorts, to refuse what pulls you away from what is right, even when it appears attractive. And I realized that the situation in front of me was not new. It was ancient. It has existed in different forms, across different times. The offering of something immediate in exchange for something eternal. The promise of gain in exchange for truth. The invitation to compromise, disguised as opportunity. And I understood that what I was facing was not unique to me. It is something every person faces at some point, in different ways, at different scales, but always with the same structure. A choice between what is easy and what is right. A choice between what benefits you now and what defines you later. And in that moment, I saw the money differently. It was no longer impressive. It was no longer heavy. It was no longer something that demanded attention. It became what it truly was. A test. A simple, clear test. And I understood something else. Without that vow, without that foundation, I might have seen it differently. I might have evaluated it, measured it, considered it, weighed its advantages. But because of that vow, I did not need to analyze it. I recognized it immediately, clearly, without confusion. And that recognition removed the struggle. Because when you see something clearly for what it is, the decision is no longer difficult. It becomes obvious, not easy, but obvious. And I realized that faith is not something that exists only in moments of peace. It is something that reveals itself in moments of pressure. It is not proven in what you say when everything is calm. It is proven in what you do when everything is uncertain. And in that room, surrounded by power, by influence, by carefully constructed offers, I understood something deeply. The strongest thing I carried into that room was not my position. It was not my authority. It was not my knowledge of politics. It was that vow. A vow I had made long before, without fully understanding how much I would need it. And yet, at that moment, it became the most important thing I had, because it did something that nothing else could do. It allowed me to see the truth without distortion. It allowed me to stand without hesitation. It allowed me to refuse without fear. Not because I am stronger than others, but because I was anchored in something that does not change. And I realized something that I believe many people forget. Faith is not meant to make life easier. It is meant to make truth clearer. And when truth is clear, decisions become possible, even when they are difficult, even when they carry consequences, even when they require you to stand alone. I sat there, aware that everything that had just happened, everything that had been offered, everything that had been implied, had led to this moment. Not the negotiation, not the pressure, but the choice. And I had already made it. Not in that room, but long before. When I said those words, when I made that vow, and in that moment, I understood something very simple. I was not just responding as a president. I was responding as someone who had promised to reject what is wrong, and no amount of money could change that, because what had been promised was not for sale. Not then, not now, not ever. When I spoke again, I did not raise my voice. There was no need. The room was already quiet enough to hear every word clearly. But this time what I said did not come from political reasoning. It came from something deeper. I looked at them and I told them something they were not prepared to hear. I told them that I am a man who has made a vow, not in a political office, not in a military setting, but before God. I told them that there was a moment in my life when I stood and declared that I would reject evil, reject corruption, and reject anything that would lead me away from truth. And I told them that what they had placed in front of me was not simply an offer. It was a test of that vow. The room did not react immediately, because this was not the language they expected. They expected negotiation. They expected calculation. They expected conditions. But they did not expect conviction rooted in something they could not influence. I continued. I told them that there is no account, no matter how secure, that is greater than a clear conscience. No amount of money that can replace integrity once it is lost. No property, no protection, no privilege that can restore what is broken when a person chooses to betray what they know is right. And I said something else. I told them that they believe every person has a price, that if the number is high enough, if the offer is structured well enough, if the pressure is applied carefully enough, then anyone can be moved. But I told them they are mistaken, because there are things that cannot be measured in numbers, and a person who still holds on to those things cannot be bought. Not because they are strong, but because they have already chosen what matters most. I could see it in their eyes. Not anger, not even frustration, something else, something closer to confusion, because they were encountering a response that did not follow the pattern. They know how to negotiate. They know how to adjust offers. They know how to increase pressure, but they do not know how to negotiate with something that is not for sale. And that is what unsettled them. I did not accuse them. I did not insult them. I simply made it clear that I could not accept, not because the offer was insufficient, but because it was unacceptable. There is a difference, and that difference is everything. I told them that if I were to accept what they offered, I would not just be making a political decision. I would be breaking a promise I made when no one was watching, a promise that does not appear in any document, but one that defines who I am. And once that is broken, nothing else remains stable. Because if a person cannot keep that kind of promise, then no agreement they sign can truly be trusted. I told them that leadership is not about securing comfort. It is about carrying responsibility. And that responsibility cannot be fulfilled if it is compromised from the beginning. And then I said something very simple. I said that there is no sum of money that can replace the ability to stand before your people without shame. No agreement that can justify losing the right to speak honestly. No benefit that can outweigh the cost of knowing you have traded what was never yours to give. Because the future of a nation does not belong to its leader. It belongs to its people. And no leader has the right to sell it. I let those words settle. I did not repeat them. Because truth, once spoken clearly, does not need to be emphasized. It only needs to be heard. The room remained still. But something had changed. Not in the structure, not in the setting, but in the expectation. because they had expected resistance. But they had also expected that resistance could be managed, adjusted, influenced. But what they encountered instead was something fixed, something that did not move, something that did not respond to pressure or to incentive. And that was not part of their calculation. I could see that they were processing it, trying to understand where to go next, because every system relies on predictability, on patterns, on responses that can be anticipated. And when something falls outside that pattern, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is something they try to avoid. But in that moment, it was there. And I understood something very clearly. The most unexpected part of my response was not that I refused. It was why I refused. Because refusal based on negotiation can be changed. But refusal based on conviction cannot. And that is what they did not expect. They did not expect someone to place a spiritual commitment above political advantage. They did not expect someone to measure the situation not by what could be gained, but by what would be lost internally. They did not expect someone to say no, not out of fear, not out of strategy, but out of faith. And that is what made the moment different. That is what made it impossible for them to adjust the offer. Because they were no longer negotiating with a position, they were facing a principle. And principles do not move. I sat there after speaking, calm, without tension, because I knew the decision was complete. There was nothing left to consider, nothing left to evaluate, nothing left to weigh. And in that certainty, there is a kind of peace, not because the situation becomes easier, but because the conflict is over. And when the conflict within ends, the pressure outside loses its power. I did not know what they would do next, but I knew one thing. Whatever came after that moment would not change what had already been decided. Because some decisions are not about outcome, they are about identity. And once identity is clear, the rest follows. After I finished speaking, the room did not erupt. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no immediate reaction. But something changed, not loudly, not visibly at first, but unmistakably. The atmosphere shifted. The warmth that had been carefully maintained from the beginning disappeared completely. The calm, confident expressions that had filled the room gave way to something colder, more distant, more controlled. It was as if a line had been crossed, not physically, but in understanding. They knew at that moment that the direction they had planned was no longer possible. And in spaces like that, when expectation breaks, silence returns. But it is no longer the same silence as before. It is heavier, more defined. The kind of silence that carries meaning without words. One by one, I noticed the subtle changes. The posture of those across the table became more rigid. The easy gestures disappeared. The sense of control they had at the beginning of the meeting was no longer present in the same way. Not because they had lost power, but because they had lost certainty. And in systems built on prediction, uncertainty is disruptive. No one spoke immediately. There was no attempt to continue the conversation in the same tone. No effort to soften what had just been said, because they understood something clearly. This was no longer a discussion that could be guided. The path they had prepared had ended, and what remained was something they had not fully accounted for, a refusal that could not be adjusted. After a moment, quiet but deliberate, the movement began. The cases were closed, not quickly, not dramatically, but with precision. Each one was lifted from the table, removed from sight, as if the physical presence of what they contained no longer had a purpose. Because once the offer is rejected, the object loses its power. And in that simple action, the message was clear. That phase was over. There were no more incentives to present, no more adjustments to make. The approach had reached its limit. The tone of the room continued to cool. There were no expressions of appreciation, no diplomatic closing phrases, no attempt to preserve the appearance of partnership. Because in moments like this, the true nature of the interaction reveals itself. And what had been hidden behind polite language was no longer necessary to conceal. We were no longer being addressed as partners. We were being observed as variables that had not aligned with expectation. And that difference is important, because it marks the moment when perception changes. I sat there calmly, aware of everything that was happening, but not surprised. Because I understood that this was inevitable. When you refuse something that others expect you to accept, the relationship changes. Not immediately in a visible way, but fundamentally, and that change does not need to be announced. It exists in the space between words, in the tone, in the absence of certain gestures, in the quiet withdrawal of what was once offered. After a few moments, someone spoke. not to reopen the discussion, not to challenge what had been said, but to close the meeting. The words were formal, controlled, neutral on the surface, but the meaning behind them was clear. This exchange had reached its conclusion. There was nothing more to discuss, not because everything had been resolved, but because nothing more could be changed. And so, we stood, not in unison, not as a coordinated gesture, but naturally, each of us aware that something significant had just taken place. Something that would not be written in official summaries, something that would not appear in any report, but something that would carry consequences. I looked around the room one last time, not to assess, not to analyze, but simply to acknowledge the moment. Because there are moments in life that define direction, not through what is gained, but through what is refused. And I knew that this was one of those moments. As we moved toward the door, I felt no sense of victory, no sense of relief, because this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something else, something that would unfold beyond that room, beyond that night, beyond that meeting. I understood that decisions like this do not exist in isolation. They create reactions, they create responses, they create pressure, not always immediately, but inevitably, and I was prepared for that. Not because I knew exactly what would come, but because I understood the nature of the system I had just refused. It does not simply step back. It adjusts. It responds. It continues. But as I walked out of that room, there was one thing I was certain of. Whatever comes next will be external. And I have already settled what is internal. And once that is settled, everything else can be faced. Because there is a difference between losing something outside and losing something within. And that night, I knew that I had not lost what matters most. As the door closed behind us, the meeting ended. But the meaning of it did not. It stayed. Not in the room, but with me. Because I understood that I had just crossed a line that separates two paths. One that leads to comfort, protected by compromise. And one that leads to uncertainty, protected by conviction. And I had chosen the second. Not because it is easier, but because it is right. And that choice, once made, cannot be undone. After leaving that room, the noise of the world slowly returned. Conversations resumed. Schedules continued. The summit carried on as if nothing had happened. And that is often how the most important moments exist. They do not interrupt the world. They pass quietly, unnoticed by most, yet they carry consequences that extend far beyond their silence. As I walked through the corridors the next day, I reflected not only on what had taken place, but on what it revealed. Not about them, but about us, about human nature, about leadership, and about faith. Because what happened in that room was not unique to presidents or to politics. It was a reflection of something universal. The way temptation presents itself, the way compromise begins, the way decisions are shaped not only by circumstances, but by what a person carries inside. And I began to understand that this experience was not only for me, it carried a message especially for those who believe, for those who speak of faith, for those who say they follow the teachings of Jesus Christ, because belief is easy when it remains in words. It is easy in places of comfort. It is easy when there is no cost attached to it. But belief is not measured in comfort. It is revealed in pressure. It is revealed in moments when something valuable is placed before you, and you must decide whether your faith is still worth more. The first lesson is simple. Not every temptation appears as something wrong. Many of them appear as something good, something helpful, something beneficial. They come with kind words, with smiles, with promises of improvement. And if you only look at the surface, you may never recognize them for what they truly are. That is why discernment is necessary. Because without it, a person can walk directly into compromise believing they are doing something reasonable. The second lesson is this. Corruption does not begin with action. It begins with thought, with a small justification, with a quiet idea that perhaps this is acceptable. Perhaps this is not as serious as it seems. Perhaps this can be managed. And once that thought is accepted, the path begins. Not suddenly, but gradually, until what once felt impossible becomes normal. And that is how many lose themselves. Not through a single decision, but through a series of small allowances. The third lesson is something every leader must understand. You cannot fight corruption outside if you have not faced it within. You cannot stand against pressure if you are already divided inside. Because external strength comes from internal clarity, And if that clarity is weak, then no position, no authority, no title will protect you. The fourth lesson speaks directly to those who believe in Jesus Christ. Faith is not meant to remain in the church. It is not meant to exist only in prayer or in words. It must enter every part of life, into decisions, into responsibilities, into moments where there is no audience, no recognition, no reward for doing what is right. Because those are the moments where faith becomes real. When you choose what is right, not because it benefits you, but because it is right. And I realized something else. The vow made during baptism is not symbolic. It is not something to remember once and then forget. It is a foundation, a reminder that must remain active, to reject evil, to reject deception, to reject anything that leads you away from truth, not only in obvious situations, but in subtle ones, in situations where the wrong choice does not look wrong at first, because those are the most dangerous. And I understood something deeply. God does not remove temptation from our lives. He does not prevent these moments from coming, but He gives us something else, the ability to recognize them and the strength to refuse them. And that strength does not come from position. It does not come from knowledge. It comes from alignment, from a heart that has already chosen what it will stand for before the moment arrives. Because if you wait until the moment to decide, it may already be too late. The pressure will be too strong. The reasoning will be too persuasive. The opportunity will be too attractive. But if the decision has already been made within, then when the moment comes, you do not hesitate. You simply act according to what you already know. And that is what happened in that room. I did not become strong in that moment. I relied on something that had already been built, something that had already been chosen. And that is why I believe this story matters. Not because of the setting, not because of the scale, but because of the principle. Every person will face their own version of that room, not with millions of dollars, not with international representatives, but with choices that test who they are. And in those moments, what will matter is not what they say they believe, but what they choose. Because choice reveals truth, always. And so, if there is one thing I would say to anyone listening, it is this. Do not wait for the moment to decide who you are. Decide now. Build that clarity now. Strengthen that conviction now, so that when the moment comes, you are not trying to find your values. You are living them. Because once you know what you stand for, no offer, no pressure, no fear can move you. Not completely, not permanently. And that is where true freedom exists. Not in what you have, but in what cannot be taken from you. There are moments in history that are remembered because they are loud. And there are moments that are remembered because they are true. What happened in that closed room between the 12th and the 14th of February was not witnessed by the world. There were no cameras, no official statements, no headlines that captured the weight of what was placed before us. And yet, I believe it matters. Not because of me, not because of the position I hold, but because of what it reveals. It reveals that the struggle for the future of Africa is not only fought on battlefields or in public negotiations, it is also fought in quiet rooms, in private conversations, in moments where decisions are made without witnesses. It reveals that the greatest threats are not always visible. They do not always arrive with force. Sometimes they arrive with opportunity, with promises, with comfort, with offers that seem reasonable, even helpful. But behind them, there is always a question. Who will decide your future? You or someone else? And that question does not belong only to nations. It belongs to individuals, to every person who must choose between what is easy and what is right. As I left that meeting, I did not feel like someone who had defeated anything. I felt like someone who had been tested, and I understood that passing one test does not end the journey. There will be others, different forms, different pressures, different circumstances, because the world does not stop testing those who choose to stand. But I also understood something else. When you have faced one moment of truth and you have remained aligned with what you believe, something changes within you, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady way. You become less uncertain, less divided, more grounded, because you have seen that it is possible to stand, even when the pressure is real, even when the cost is high. And that realization becomes a source of strength for the future. I do not tell this story to present myself as strong, because strength is not something a person claims. It is something that is revealed over time. I tell this story because I believe the world needs reminders. Reminders that integrity still exists. Reminders that not everything can be bought. reminders that there are still lines that should not be crossed. And more importantly, reminders that faith, when it is real, does not remain silent in moments that matter. I think about the future often, not only the future of Burkina Faso, but the future of Africa, and even beyond that, the future of a world that is increasingly shaped by power, by influence, by systems that often prioritize control over truth. And I ask myself a simple question: what kind of world do we want to leave behind? One where decisions are made in hidden rooms guided by money and pressure? Or one where decisions are made with transparency, with responsibility, and with respect for those who will live with the consequences? That choice is not made once. It is made again and again, by leaders, by institutions, by individuals, and each time it shapes the direction we move in. I also think about those who are listening, those who are older, who have seen more of the world, who understand that life is not always simple, that decisions are rarely easy, that the line between right and wrong can sometimes feel unclear. To you, I say this: you understand better than most that character is not built in comfort. It is revealed in challenge. And no matter how far someone has come, no matter how much they have seen, there is always a moment where they must choose again, to remain aligned or to compromise. And that choice never loses its importance. Not with age, not with experience, not with position, because as long as we are alive, we are still being shaped by the decisions we make. I hope that what I experience serves as a reminder, not of me, but of something greater, that there is still value in standing firm, that there is still meaning in keeping a promise, even when no one is watching, that there is still strength in choosing what is right, even when it costs something. And I hope that those who hear this will reflect on their own lives, not in judgment, but in honesty, to ask themselves where they stand, what they believe, what they would do when faced with their own moment, because that moment will come in different ways, at different times, but it will come. And when it does, what matters will not be what others expect. It will be what you choose. As for me, I continue forward, not without difficulty, not without awareness of the challenges ahead, but with clarity, with the understanding that the path I have chosen is not the easiest one, but it is the right one, and that is enough. I hope for a world where nations respect one another without hidden conditions, where cooperation is genuine, where development does not come at the cost of sovereignty, where leadership is measured not by what is gained, but by what is protected. I hope for an Africa that stands on its own strength, not isolated, but not controlled, connected, but not dependent, respected, because it respects itself. And beyond Africa, I hope for something even greater, a world where truth is not negotiable, where integrity is not optional, where faith is not hidden, and where people remember that some things are worth more than any amount of money. If this story has reached you, then perhaps it was meant to, not for agreement, but for reflection. And if you feel that it speaks to something true, then carry that truth with you. Share it, discuss it, because conversations matter, awareness matters. And sometimes the simplest act of speaking about what is right can create change in ways we do not immediately see. I will end with this, not as a declaration of power, but as a statement of responsibility. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. What I have shared with you is not a story shaped for effect. It is a truth I have lived. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. These words come from experience, from conviction, and from a moment that tested everything I stand for. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. And what I have told you is true. And if you believe that truth matters, then hold on to it and let it guide you wherever you are, in whatever decisions you face.